Hi, everyone. Welcome to Smarter Lending, the essential podcast for environmental, construction, and appraisal due diligence insights. My name is Liz Mahoney. As your host and the Director of Sales and Business Development at Lender Consulting Services, I bring 15 years of national lending expertise to the table. Join us as we engage with industry experts to demystify due diligence, reveal insider knowledge, and stay ahead of the trends. Whether you're in the trenches or new to the field, tune in for Smarter Lending Strategies. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Smarter Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Mahoney. Today, we're excited to bring you the second episode of our series on SBA construction lending, titled Building Smarter, Managing the Construction Draw Phase. In our latest episode, we covered the key steps in construction due diligence. This time, we'll focus on managing the construction draw phase, ensuring projects stay on track and within budget. Joining me again are our experts, Nick Jellum, President of Jellum Law PA, and Michelle Walters, our SBA loan guru. New to the panel is Trevor Richardson, expert in construction management and disbursement, and project manager at Lender Consulting Services. Together, we'll discuss critical documentation, legal safeguards, and the importance of a 10% contingency and funding soft costs into the loan. We'll explore the value of a comprehensive pre-construction analysis, best practices for managing disbursements, and ensuring draw requests are properly documented. We'll also cover physical inspections, third-party monitoring, and maintain project balance. In this episode, we'll also touch on the common issues faced during the draw phase and how to address them proactively, from dealing with budget overruns to handling disputes and ensuring all lien waivers are collected and filed correctly. Our experts will provide valuable insights and practical solutions. We'll highlight the importance of constant communication among all parties involved to keep the project on track and mitigate risks effectively. Stay tuned as we dive into managing construction draws, providing strategies and knowledge to help you lend smarter. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started with today's episode. Let's get right into it. Nick, can you briefly recap the key due diligence steps taken during the closing process of a construction loan?
Sure. So, of course, when we think about construction projects, especially from a commercial lending standpoint and certainly from an SBA lending standpoint, we have to think about how are we going to set this project up and this loan transaction up for a successful flow. And that really starts with the due diligence. So obviously, we have to take a look at things such as the plans and specs, the title commitment, the contractor's agreement, architect's agreement, various permitting requirements. So we really get our arms around what does the project look like. And then from there, of course, we would have specific due diligence that may apply, such as an as-built survey. We may have some other issues with respect to environmental appraisals and the like. So we really set that table, if you will, with our due diligence at the outset, understanding the transaction, and then making sure that we are really methodical as we go through and build out that process.
Thanks for that recap, Nick. Michelle, I know you have a lot to say about SBA nuances that should be considered before the construction phase begins. Can you share some highlights with us?
Yeah, so as you know, Liz, I could talk for an hour about SBA nuances and things that should be considered, but a few key points to SBA financing. First, the SBA does require a 10% contingency. Many borrowers will push back on that. They don't like the idea of the project costs getting driven up. But at the same time, the bank doesn't have a choice. It's an SBA guideline, and I think it's a good guideline. I would love to say that everyone comes in on time, and in a beautiful world, that every project lands on time for the cost that was projected. That rarely happens, and so having that contingency really is key. Second, I think it's a great point as well, is that with SBA financing, we can finance in soft costs. So architect fees, engineering fees, sometimes permitting can be quite expensive. And so we can roll that into the loan Again, clients can sometimes push back on that a little bit because, again, they don't like to drive up that cost. But at the same time, we can take those soft cost fees and we can put them in a loan. And then the last, I think, the last point I want to make with SBA financing, and I would hope that this happens in general, but the SBA requires that the GC be fully vetted, that the bank collect documentation on the VC or the GC that basically, shows the type of jobs that they've been doing. Are they skilled in the type of job that you're looking to build? What's the track record been? What's their financials look like? Sometimes we'll ask for financials. We need to make sure that the contractor is reputable and can get the job done on time. And so we do rely on services like yourselves, third-party monitoring services to help us vet those GCs as well. So those are some of the key points, I think, that maybe key advantages, I think, that go along with utilizing SBA, funding for construction.
Those are great points, Michelle. Trevor, can you tell us, how does a comprehensive pre-construction analysis help in mitigating risks during the construction phase?
We really see this as the first step in the risk mitigation process from the construction standpoint. A pre-construction analysis provides a high-level review of the main components of the project. I would say the big three are the drawings, the budget, and the contract. But of course, there's a multitude of documentation that goes into a report of that nature. But a thorough review of these three can really help identify the big issues before the deal closes or construction even begins, such as budgets that don't align with the contract amounts, over or under budgeted scheduled value for the work, missing language out of contracts, unrealistic terms for the contracts, incomplete drawings, or drawings with design contradictions. Being able to get in front of these ahead of the time really does set us up for success.
That's some great tips, Trevor. Moving on to managing the construction project, what are the best practices for managing disbursements during the construction phase?
Absolutely. Disbursements are always recommended to be conducted on a monthly basis. As Michelle discussed, AIA applications for payment should be used to track the progress of the project on a line-by-line basis for the scopes of work. For the billing percentages, that should be representative of the completed work, right? Physical on-site inspections are also recommended, as this is key to being able to substantiate the request and provides both the lender and whoever the third-party diligence firm is photographic documentation for review and to track the progress throughout the duration of the job. All the other required documentation from the lender should be shared with the diligence firm to ensure the internal bank requirements are being met at each stage throughout the progress.
Michelle, how do you ensure that draw requests are properly documented and justified?
I think I'm old school. I go back to the old spreadsheet and I kind of track things that way. There's also different software you can use. But I think that in all reality, a solid lender will have a construction specialist in-house. We will also work hand in hand with the due diligence firms like yourself. We'll utilize those AIA contracts as well, just to verify that the project is going on, as outlined. I mean, we rely on those outlines that we get from the GC and the borrower in the beginning that tells us when the job should be done and what each item should cost. And so it really is just honestly making sure that every time a draw comes in, it's matching that draw to what's in the spreadsheet, what's been outlined, and making sure that we're staying on time. We're staying on time, and we're staying within budget or within reason.
Nick, what legal safeguards should be in place to protect the lender during the disbursement process?
Well, certainly from a title standpoint, I mean, we're always thinking about how do we guard against liens. And from there, we really have to think about the different laws for mechanic liens in the various jurisdictions. And so certainly relying on title insurers as well as third-party construction monitoring and dispersing firms, that's really key to ensure not only that, to Michelle and Trevor's points, that the funds are dispersed in accordance with the plans and specs and what we expect from the project, but then also making sure that something between the borrower, possibly the general contractor, a subcontractor, or otherwise, hasn't gone sideways that would potentially result in a mechanic lien. I think from a legal perspective, protecting the lender really comes down to protecting the priority of the mortgage lien or the deed of trust position. And of course, from an SBA standpoint, that's paramount in protecting our SBA guarantee as well.
Thanks, Nick. Trevor, how do you coordinate disbursement schedules with project milestones to ensure smooth progress?
The biggest factor with smooth disbursements from the diligence side is the accuracy of the application for payment. Requesting monies for a scope in progress is not a problem as long as the request is comparable to the billing percentage of the application. For example, if drywall is being installed and finished, if they're requesting half of the money, we need to see half the work completed. It should be a 1-to-1 ratio for that. When the billing percentage becomes greater than the work observed, additional time is always required for review, additional questions, possibly different backup. So the accuracy of the application is definitely critical to making sure it's as smooth as possible. On a milestone billing type of project, a request should only be submitted once all the items within the milestone are 100% complete. These requests are generally all or nothing types of fundings, and when only 80% of the work of the milestone is complete, it really puts a kink in the disbursement, as additional conversations have to be had, additional approvals may be warranted, and then the lender may not even fund. If the milestone is not met, it may just be a zero funding event, and then we have to go forward from there.
Thanks, Trevor. Michelle, what are common issues you encounter with disbursements, and how do you usually address them?
I think first and foremost, the biggest issue we run into is construction going over budget. We talked about it earlier, and very rarely comes in on budget. I don't think I've ever seen a project come in on budget. With that, it is so important to monitor the contingency funds to ensure there are enough funds to finish the project, right? And it's very important to have conversations with the borrower as soon as you see a problem. Start having conversations to say, what can be scaled back? How can we move funds? It's very often that a good construction, monitoring person will look at the budget and start moving items around. What can we steal from here to make up for here? You may have to be having conversations with the borrower about additional funds coming into the project, but it definitely is kind of comes down to monitoring that budget, and that leads to time. Weather plays a big part of our process. And so if you have a foundation that has to go in by, in let's say my area in Kansas City, we need a foundation in no later than November because we hit frozen tundra then, we can't lay foundation. So it's getting out in front of it and making sure that the necessary items that have to get done within weather-related issues are getting done appropriately, because again, now you're pushing off the delay of the project, and again, you're going to run out of funds before maybe the building gets completed. So money and time, those are the two biggest issues, and it's staying on top of that budget and staying on top of that timeline to ensure that you can have enough to get done.
So Nick, how can lenders mitigate risks associated with disbursement delays?
Well, first of all, I think to Michelle's point, expect the unexpected, right? And build that into the loan approval. And really, when it comes down to things such as cost overruns or delays, making sure that from a legal protection standpoint, those issues are covered in the loan agreement between the lender and the borrower. The dispersing agreement between the lender, the borrower, the general contractor, and the dispersing agent. And then also making sure that we understand how both of those documents are consistent or perhaps inconsistent with the construction contract. So, for example, things such as change orders. We have to make sure from a lender perspective, we are putting safeguards in place in the loan documents and the loan agreement with the borrower, stating that the borrower only has authority up to a certain dollar amount for change orders without the lender's prior written consent. And then making sure that's consistent throughout. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if the AIA construction contract allows for up to a $50,000 change order without consent from the general contractor's perspective, but then the loan agreement states that the borrower has to get consent from the lender for anything over $10,000. So that's just an example of how, from a legal perspective, we definitely want to make sure that we are protecting ourselves and putting safeguards in place, and then ultimately making sure that if there are events of default, that the loan documents will provide the lender with the authority and the right to cease any further disbursements until such time as the lender gets comfortable with the project moving forward. Again, I think to Michelle's point, if we have a situation where the borrower is not able to provide evidence of additional contingency funds, now we have to think about, should we be dispersing more funds? Because if it's inevitable that this project may not be completed, are we just kind of, for lack of a better term, throwing good money after bad?
Makes sense. I want to dive a little bit more into the lien waivers. Trevor, what's the importance of obtaining lien waivers throughout the construction process? What type of lien waivers are there?
The lien waivers are essential for a lender to be able to protect the project against liens and ensure the project, the dispersed funds for the project are flowing to the appropriate parties each month. There should be lien waivers from all of the subcontractors and suppliers included in the current request, as well as an overall lien waiver from the general contractor and the amount being requested for that period. As for the types of lien waivers, each state has different requirements, but generally we'd like to see conditional and unconditional lien waivers each month. Conditional lien waivers are for the current period and are essentially a promise that once the contractor, subcontractor, suppliers are paid and the funds are dispersed, they won't have the right to lien against the property for the work that's previously been done. An unconditional lien waiver is for the prior requests, and they come after the funds are dispersed. And they state that they have been paid in full, and then they're guaranteeing that right to not lien. Unconditional lien waivers are very important, as these verify the payment to both the GC and the subcontractors. So with each request, we should be seeing the conditional lien waivers for the current request and unconditional lien waivers from the prior submission. And that goes for both the general contractor and the subcontractor.
So, Michelle, how do you manage and track lien waivers for multiple subcontractors?
I go back to the AA contract definitely helps us with that a little bit. Again, just kind of good internal processes and procedures. I maintain pretty detailed spreadsheets. And it really is, I hate to say it's as simple as, but it really is as simple as what's being requested, what do you have in hand, and matching the two together and making sure that every single thing is there. So many times when lien waivers come in, you're in a hurry and things get missed. And it really is just that double checking of it really is a simple process, but it's taking the time to manage the process. And again, using third-party firms like yourself definitely as a nice insurance program for many lenders.
So, Nick, what legal implications arise from failing to secure lien waivers, and how can that be avoided?
Sure. Well, I think to the comments that both Trevor and Michelle made, having a process in place, understanding, to my point earlier, the laws of the state in which the property is located, and then making sure that we're also staying in lockstep with the title insurer. At the end of the day, a lien may not be avoidable. However, from a legal perspective, what lenders rely on is, kind of a series of gatekeepers, if you will, right? So first of all, with the lien waivers, and whether it's a third-party construction monitoring firm, an inspecting architect, or the title company, we're first wanting to make sure that we're covering off on the state law or jurisdictional requirement. But as a fail-safe, we have to make sure that the title insurer is blessing the lien waivers as well, because if there does become a dispute, we want to make sure from a lender perspective that we can rely on our title insurance. After all, that's really for construction projects, the title insurance is really the cornerstone of the legal protection at the end of the day, such that if there were to be a dispute over priority of liens, the lender's mortgage lien versus a mechanic lien, the lender needs to be able to go to the title insurer and say, okay, we need you to defend this lien priority argument. And again, at the end of the day, a few things that we need to make sure of. If and when we end up having to foreclose on the property, we need to make sure that it won't be subject to a priority lien in favor of a contractor. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that all goes to the ultimate result of protecting that SBA guarantee. SBA is very clear that if the lender doesn't take the proper prudent lending practices to protect its lien against claims of others, such as mechanic lien, that could result in a denial, whether in whole or partial denial of the guarantee. So we have these series of safeguards in place because obviously there's not always a silver bullet issue at hand, and we have to kind of go through the processes to protect the lender's legal position.
So Trevor, what best practices do you follow to ensure all lien waivers are collected and they're properly filed?
I think Michelle nailed it with her response. The best practice is like a spreadsheet type of document that gets updated with each request, and then always can be cross-referenced throughout the project and with each succeeding submission. Organization and diligence is key for proper tracking. This really should be a must for every lender, where once it's reviewed, we need to make sure dates are updated. The proper amount being requested aligns with the current request. The official name of the contractor, whether it be the general contractor or the subcontractor. Everything's dated properly, and then usually these are also notarized. So we need to double check each one of these fields are properly updated from month in, month out with each of the requests.
So Trevor, let's shift gears a little bit. Can you walk us through the typical process of a draw request from initiation to approval?
Yeah, absolutely. Inspection requests, I will say, should always be coming right from the lender to ensure that they're being authorized and they're approved on their end before we initiate from the diligence side. So once we get that request within 24 hours of the submission, we generally have the physical inspection scheduled with a point of contact. And then we also make sure that we're adhering to any lender-specific turnaround times for the inspection and the subsequent report. All inspections should be accompanied by knowledgeable site staff to be able to clearly identify the work that has been completed for that current period and in that request, answer any questions regarding the current request, and provide any additional answers the inspector may have while on site. Once that inspection has been conducted over the next 24 hours, the inspector and the project manager or whomever will be providing the approval and report generally discuss and review the request, and then the approval would be sent to the lender once the full request is substantiated. Sometimes there is the need for additional documentation, additional questions, clarifications, and it's paramount everyone involved from the general contractor side, the lender, and the diligence firm be included on the outreach to make sure everyone is in that lockstep and the correct expectations are being set to get the documentation to be able to fully approve that request.
Thanks, Trevor. Michelle, what documentation is essential for successful draw requests?
I worked for lenders that have had their own internal draw request form, but I do recommend using the AIE draw request form. It's called the Application and Certificate for Payment form. It really details what is being requested and ensures that the GC, the bank, and the borrower are all on the same page in relation to not only what is being drawn, but also what is left on the job. Then just ensure that you have a signed lien waiver. I know that sounds crazy, but make sure everything's signed. I think, Trevor, you're laughing because you've probably seen it before. And then obviously, review and review and review, right? It's all there.
So Nick, from a legal standpoint, how do you handle disputes that arise during the draw request process?
Well, first and foremost, hopefully we have the documentation and the provisions in the loan documents and the disbursement documents to allow the lender to stop disbursement. Because, of course, that's from a lender perspective and a legal perspective, that is the lender's best leverage, right? And making sure that we can stop the flow of funds to really just say, look, we need to pump the brakes on this project and we need to understand what the issues are. We need to address the issues not only from that particular draw perspective, but then moving forward. Are we just putting a Band-Aid on it and kicking the can down the road? That's not what we want to try to achieve if there is an issue. We want to understand what gave rise to it and make sure that we are putting pieces in place to not have a similar issue happen again. And if that calls for modifying or amending documents at that point in time, those are the kind of steps that we would take from a legal perspective to, again, make sure that while we're not only protecting the lender's best interest at that point in time, we're also, of course, still trying to help the borrower and the general contractor get the project completed, but making sure we don't have similar hiccups down the road.
Michelle, what are the most common issues that cause draw requests to be denied or delayed?
Well, request for payment of services not completed. That would be probably the first one. Missing lien waivers, second, and then lien waivers not being signed. It's amazing how many GCs will send in lien waivers. It'll be completely filled out, but it won't have the sub's signature on it. And it's kind of amazing how much that happens. And then probably the biggest issue why basically draw requests will be declined or denied or delayed is what Nick just said. The draw request is a significant jump over the cost that was budgeted. At that point, before payments being made, the lender needs to stop, call in the GC, call in the borrower, and figure out how we're going to get this project back on track, whether it be from additional funding, whether it be maybe you have to go to the loan committee and get this loan revised, whatever it is. Maybe there's changes in the plans and specs that you can maybe bring down some finishes on the back end, but it's basically stopping the process and making sure that we get the project back on track.
Nick, what legal requirements must be met during construction inspection?
Well, a few things. I mean, certainly construction inspection, we want to make sure that the progress has been made that is consistent with the plans and specs, consistent with the construction contract. But then from a legal perspective, we also want to make sure that the work being completed is being completed in conjunction with and compliance with all applicable zoning requirements or other permitting requirements of the municipality that's issuing the permits. Ultimately, we need to make sure that the project is being completed in a manner that would achieve a number of things at the end of the day. Number one, certainly the issuance of the certificate of occupancy, but also we want to make sure that when completed, the project will meet the expectations of the as-built appraisal, as well as be within the confines of the as-completed survey. So a lot of things that we take and look at, and we can't just wait until that final inspection to make sure that everything came together. We need to be methodical at every step of the way just to make sure that we don't have a situation where we may have some ultimate issues and kind of surprises that come up. So really being kind of methodical at each inspection is key.
Michelle, how do you coordinate inspections to align with project milestones and draw requests?
I kind of joke that coordinating the timing and the number of draw requests on a construction project is an art form. Most banks and third-party monitoring firms charge for each inspection and draw. So the more draws you have, the more the cost goes up. We talked about earlier, borrowers want to keep that cost project down. Each project is different, so I like to sit with the GC and the borrower in the beginning and go over the timeline of the entire AIA contract and talk through what makes sense. And I kind of call it the chunking process, the chunking exercise, if you will, where you start to look through the project and you start to figure out, okay, let's theoretically look at maybe making a draw here. And so then, and if you set that process out in the beginning, there's not as many surprises down the road. And you kind of even know, and you can kind of even tell, like when a project reaches a certain point, oh yeah, we probably have a draw coming in. So I think that's something you have to plan out with the GC and the borrower early in the beginning to make it a smoother process for everyone involved and keep the cost down.
And Nick, how do you handle situations where inspections reveal noncompliance or defects?
Well, again, as I mentioned before, if we see something like that on an inspection, and this is why inspections are so key, we do have to just pump the brakes, and we have to make sure that we're not moving forward with that disbursement or other disbursements until those defects have been addressed and corrected. Now, of course, from a standpoint of a construction defect, that can take on a life of its own. And hopefully it's a minor defect, but if it's a significant defect that will, again, potentially cause whether it's issues with meeting the permitting requirements or even worse, potentially hazardous conditions, right? I mean, we have to really be able to take a look at that, assess it. And if we need to bring third parties in, I think this is a key that some lenders and certainly borrowers push back on, general contractors I've seen push back on. They don't like to be second guessed. But in my experience, if an issue like that comes up, it means that while somebody may not have purposefully dropped the ball, there was something that occurred that folks were not expecting. And so that may require bringing in a third-party engineering firm or otherwise to, again, not only correct and remedy the defects, but ensure that those issues aren't carried forward in the project.
Let's talk a little bit about keeping the project in balance. Trevor, what strategies do you use to keep construction projects on schedule and in mind?
Unfortunately, both of those issues are generally in the hands of the general contractor. Being on the diligence side, it's hard to control those. We can monitor those and provide key items for the lender to kind of help mitigate those risks. But on the general contractor side, kind of regarding the budget, it's key to ensure that the estimates given while creating the budget are satisfactory and encompass all the work within the scope to minimize any of the surprises that would cause the increases. The issuance of change orders throughout the project needs to be monitored to make sure they're appropriate, and when it comes time for funding, to be utilizing the right contingency when it comes time. There's owner's contingencies, contractor's contingencies. That should be thoroughly detailed and then funded from the appropriate pool. For the schedule, we always recommend a CPM or a critical path method construction schedule be utilized, which helps navigate the shortest path to completion while also allowing for lead and lag times between tasks where time can be made up if delays are encountered. A good site superintendent should be on top of all the subcontractors and effectively communicate to set the schedule expectations and make sure the project has the proper flow, and to not hold up certain trades while others still need to finish. The example is you can't have the drywall crew come in and start hanging drywall until all the rough mechanical, electrical, plumbing has been installed, inspected. Any of that rework or corrective work really does throw the schedule and the budget through a loop.
Michelle, how do you handle budget reallocations during the construction phase?
Yeah, I just go back to what I said earlier. It's having the tough conversation with the GC and the borrower the minute you know there's an issue. Construction costs can get out of hand very quickly. It's not something that you can put off even a day or two. You have to have the conversation immediately. You may even need to shut down the project until you're able to get the funds figured out and reallocated. But at the end of the day, it is, if everyone is on the same page to understand we're having this conversation to make sure we get through a complete project so that you can get back in that building and become functional and operational, our overall goal, it's just staying on top of it every single day. You just can't let a day go by when you are reallocating funds. You can't.
What legal protection should be included in contracts to address potential imbalances in the project?
Sure. So I think there has to be a mechanism to get the contract back in balance or the project back in balance. Now, Michelle has mentioned the importance of borrower being able to bring in contingency funds. One issue that lenders, I think, would be prudent to take a look at the outset of the project is perhaps, for lack of a better term, a lending contingency. Meaning this, are there times, and we've seen it, right, where there are just situations where there are cost overruns, but we need to get the project completed, but the borrower doesn't have any access to additional funds. So then the question becomes, and of course Michelle probably hears this more than I do, is, well, lender, why can't you just lend me more money? I mean, you've got all the money. It should be pretty easy, right? Well, I mean, of course there are some implications in there, and certainly a number of things come into play. Of course, at the end of the day, if there are cost overruns, if the lender is going to look at lending more funds, the question then becomes, will the project as-built appraisal support those additional funds? And again, that's maybe where, and when I see really experienced lenders looking at a project, like we mentioned earlier, the only thing that we can expect is the unexpected. So going into it, maybe even without letting the borrower know, but internally having the lender credit team say, we should build in a contingency from our lending perspective. Now, of course, that then had to be a situation where we have to account for that in the loan documents, certainly not by stating that we'll lend more money if we have to, but by putting the mechanism in place. And of course, at the end of the day, we really need to make sure that if the project cannot be brought back into compliance or into budget, so to speak, will the lender be able to step in and take over the project from the borrower perspective, right? And so from there, we definitely, from a contractual standpoint, want to have assignments of the construction contract, the architect's contract, collateral assignments of the permits, everything that would be necessary if, under extreme circumstances, the lender had to step in and complete the project.
Michelle, what tools or systems do you use to monitor and report on project balance?
I have worked with multiple banks and multiple systems, but ideally I like to have my own spreadsheet, and I do that because I think it's important for me to understand and know how that project is going to flow. And it's important to, I think, sometimes do your own due diligence as a lender, as a banker, to understand. Don't hand it off to your closing department and just walk away from it. You need to know. You need to understand when those draws come in, what they mean, and where we're at in the project. So I believe that's key. To Nick's point, definitely running the numbers and making sure we have enough cash flow. Should the project go over budget, we have to lend out. I think as much as it is getting a complete project, it's one of making sure that we don't end up with a loan that the borrower can't afford to pay on down the road as well. So making sure that you're not letting that borrower get out over their skis a little bit in the size of their project. And sometimes you may have to say, yes, I know you want building A, but building B will still get you what you need, still put you operational, and we can build it out to building A down the road. So some of those things I think that maybe help a little bit, but I think as a lender, it's really understanding the project and making sure that the what's being asked for is staying on budget and staying on time, and having those hard conversations when those don't align.
Nick, moving on, what legal considerations should be taken into account when conducting an appraisal?
Sure. Well, of course, we need to first understand what is the purpose of the as-built appraisal. And just like it sounds, it is the anticipated value, assuming the construction is completed based on the plans and specs and construction contract and sworn construction statement that are provided to the appraiser at the outset. And so, of course, we need to understand that from a standpoint of the lender's loan to value ratio at the end of the day, because of what we're looking for, obviously from a collateral standpoint, are we going to end up with the value in the collateral that we need to from a security position, and not just from the lender's internal credit requirement, but from the SBA's requirement as well. And so really understanding and making sure that not just the appraiser has to understand what is expected of that as-built appraisal, but the borrower needs to understand the importance of it. And I think what a lot of times borrowers don't understand is that's to protect them as much as it is to protect the lender. Because, of course, if they're going to expend those funds, whether it's out of pocket or borrowed funds, they want to make sure that they get the asset that they bargained for and expected following the construction as well. So making sure, sitting down from a lender perspective, making sure that the borrower really understands the importance of keeping that project in line with the plans and specs and sworn construction statement to ensure that that end value ends up where it needs to be.
And Nick, you talked a little earlier about certificate of occupancy. What legal implications are associated with certificate of occupancy? How can they impact the lender?
Sure. Well, I mean, from a general standpoint, certificate of occupancy is necessary for an owner to actually occupy a premises after construction, and especially if it is a premises that is going to be open to the public or to other invitees. So without that certificate of occupancy, we have a lot of domino effects that fall the wrong way. First and foremost, with respect to the owner or the borrower, without that certificate of occupancy, are they even able to open their business or reopen their business if it's a rehab project or an expansion? And that then goes to cash flow. If they're not able to be open, whether it's a retail location or manufacturing or otherwise, But if they're not able to actually utilize the premises, how does that affect their cash flow and their revenue generation? And then from a lender standpoint, of course, the lender has to be thinking about, if that occurs, how is this borrower going to repay the loan? And from an SBA standpoint, we also have to be thinking about specific timelines and deadlines that are put in place. So most construction loans will have a defined construction period within which time the construction has to be completed and the certificate of occupancy has to be issued. And at that point in time, the loan typically will convert from an interest-only payment to principal and interest. That's first and foremost from a credit standpoint, but from an SBA standpoint, we have to be thinking about that as well. Typically, SBA allows lenders to provide borrowers with up to a 12-month initial period for construction. And certainly, if that needs to be extended, it could be. But then ultimately, and this may sound like a long period of time, but the SBA has a strict 48-month full disbursement period as well. So there are things that go into play, and I mention those because, again, we have to make sure at the end of the day that certificate of occupancy is issued, and that's why it's important to make sure that we're keeping the project on task so we meet those deadlines.
Zach, I want to talk a little bit about release of retainage. Trevor, what's the process for releasing retainage at the end of a construction project?
Retainage withholding is really on a contract-by-contract basis. Stipulations regarding the release should always be included within the executed contracts. Sometimes receive retainage release throughout the project as trades complete the work. Others at 50% completion will get a portion released, and some will be held all the way until substantial completion and then released. Retainage can vary from 2.5% to 10% of the completed work. All these requirements should be included within the contracts to make sure everyone is aware of the requirements. I always say whenever retainage is being requested, we always recommend that it be completed on a separate application solely dedicated to the release. If additional funds for completed work are included, it really muddles the waters between what exactly is being requested. If additional withholding is also being withheld back within the request, and especially if exact percentages or dollar values for the release need to be precisely defined. A separate application really defines exactly what trades the release is coming from, the percentage, if it goes from a 10% to a 5%, a 5% to 0%. That separate application really defines that. All the requirements for the release should be communicated to the parties so that a proper review can be made to make sure that they've been met. This generally is usually the last funding for the project, so it needs to be clear that the project is complete. Occasionally a portion of the retainage is withheld during the punch list process, where let's say 200% of punch list costs are withheld until they're completed, that's verified by the architect. In a nutshell, really retainage requirements need to be met both against the contract and the lender stipulations. And if it's the final release for the project, confirmation of completion, it really is key.
Thanks, Trevor. So, Nick, I'm gonna pick on you for a little bit and tap into your legal expertise with a few rapid fire questions. Okay.
Fire away.
Let's start with what legal issues can arise from the release of retainage and how can they be prevented?
Well, I think to Trevor's point, right? I mean, the whole point of retainage is to ensure that the project is finished as contracted for. And so making sure from a legal perspective, we really need to make sure that all of the requirements under the contract and under the as-built appraisal, as-completed survey, plans and specs, all of those are what we would consider conditions precedent to the final disbursement under the loan. And so that's the lender's way of protecting itself from making a premature distribution or disbursement for the release of that retainage. And so that's really what we want to start out with, is that provision in the loan agreement between the borrower and the lender. But as I mentioned earlier, we also like to make sure that everybody involved in the project's on the same page. So that same verbiage or provision should be carried forward into the dispersing agreement that the contractor is a party to, as well as the dispersing agent. So everybody is aware from day one of the project, we look at the end result and the last disbursement for retainage, and we want to make sure that there's no surprises for anybody at that point in time.
Now, what legal strategies can be employed to manage risks during the construction phase?
Well, I think certainly, again, expecting the unexpected, and from a documentation standpoint to protect the lender's legal rights and remedies. I hate to say it because it's going to sound like me being a lawyer, but I guess that's what I am. So, we really have to hope for the best and plan for the worst. And when I think about that, I really do go all the way to kind of an Armageddon type situation at the outset of the loan and think, okay, if the worst happens and we as the lender need to take over the project, how do we accomplish that? And then really thinking about it from a legal strategy standpoint, okay, if the borrower just kind of flakes out and says, this is way more than I thought, and I'm completely upside down on this project, and I'm just going to cut my losses and pull the plug. Okay, from a lender perspective, how do we step in and finish that project? Are we able to, if we would prefer, keep the general contractor on the project? So there, again, we would look at having a collateral assignment of the construction contract. Do we want to maintain the project architect? Do we have the ability to continue the project under the borrower, the permits that were issued in favor of the borrower? All of those things. And of course, ultimately, we think about if we even as the lender look at the project and say, there's no way to salvage this, then what are our rights and remedies under the loan documents and at law to go in and actually foreclose the property and try to salvage what value is available through the foreclosure and subsequent sale of the property?
What legal trends should lenders be aware of in the construction industry?
Well, I think certainly we learned a lot, or hopefully learned a lot from COVID. And I can tell you from my perspective, there are provisions that I see in construction contracts and in architect agreements and otherwise that we didn't always see pre-COVID, because especially things like these issues that pop up that cause a permanent or indefinite delay on the project, whether it's because, quite frankly, just an issue related to workforce or to supplies and materials. We heard a lot of the catchphrase supply chain issues, all of those types of things. And of course, one phenomenon we're seeing now too is an issue with insurance companies and insurers not necessarily being willing to provide the types of insurance that we're used to having borrowers obtain. So all of these things need to be contemplated for in the loan documents. And quite frankly, if we rewind it all the way to our prior podcast discussion into the due diligence, right? And we really need to understand what if the unthinkable happens. I mean, I don't think anybody on this podcast team thought that COVID was coming pre-2020. So hopefully something like that doesn't happen again. But how do we learn from that? And from those trends, if you will, that we saw during that time and coming out of COVID, what then are some additional safeguards that we would put in place? And again, we really have to think about kind of some of those worst case scenarios.
So what are the legal implications of not adhering to construction timelines and budgets?
Well, I think from a legal perspective, construction timelines and budgets, let's face it, everybody, whether it's the owner, the general contractor, the lender, or otherwise, everybody wants a project to be completed as drawn up, completed on time, and completed on budget. And I don't know that the percentage is real high where all three of those happen in a singular project. So we look at it from a legal standpoint and what are the ramifications if any one of those factors don't come to fruition, right? So to your point, and we've talked about if it goes over budget, I think we have some safeguards we can put into place there. the timing, that's more of an issue. I think that's outside of a lender's control, but we certainly need to be we need to think about what the ramifications could be. And then, of course, ultimately making sure the project is completed as anticipated. This all then goes back again to those documents, the core construction loan agreement that really governs not only the lender's right and obligations to disperse the loan, but what are the lender's remedies if any of those factors don't come to fruition?
So how can lenders protect themselves legally during the construction phase?
Well, I think partnering with the right vendors. So certainly I always kind of think about lender, who are you working with from a title insurance perspective? Who is your appraiser? Who is the surveyor? Who is the inspecting architect? And then, of course, most importantly, I think, who is the dispersing agent? And because it all comes back from a lender perspective, at least in my point of view, control of the disbursements to ensure that the project progresses as anticipated. So again, I think from a lender protection standpoint, it's really about those vendors and other parties that the lender can rely upon. And I think, Michelle, you made a great point earlier that the lender has to stay plugged in and tuned into the project. But let's face it, I mean, lending institutions are not surveyors. They are not title insurers. They are not appraisers. So we have to make sure that we are comfortable and confident in those vendor partners that we bring into the project.
Before I give you a break, Nick, what are the critical covenants and stipulations that should be included in the agreement to mitigate risk?
I mean, from a construction standpoint, the big ones are going to be, now this sounds like a fancy legal term, but the conditions precedent to disbursements. And a lot of times what you'll see are different requirements based on where we're at in the project. So typically when I draft a construction loan agreement, in the conditions to disbursements section, I will have conditions that are required prior to the first disbursement. And those are just the straightforward things, right? Do we have the construction contract? Do we have the permits? Do we have the insurance in place? Then we move through the life cycle of the project. So next it would be, what are the conditions going to be for each draw after the first disbursement? Trevor talked about it, Michelle talked about it, as far as lien waivers, inspections, etc. And then finally, as I just mentioned, the last would be the conditions that are required prior to that final disbursement. And again, that goes into things such as release of retainage. We want to make sure that we understand that everything has been completed in order for that certificate of occupancy to be issued. So to me, that's step one, Liz. We have to have those conditions that give the lender the safeguards to ensure that before funds are dispersed, certain conditions are met. And then, of course, hand in hand with that, the other primary covenants that we have to look for, if you will, in a loan agreement are the events of default. And then the remedies. So if certain things don't occur, what constitutes an event of default? And then ultimately, what are the lender's rights, either legally under the applicable law in the jurisdiction in which the property is located, or under the contract? And for those of us who aren't necessarily attorneys, we have to understand at the end of the day, that construction loan agreement, that creates a contractual obligation and relationship between the borrower and the lender.
All right, Nick, I'm going to give you that well-deserved break. Thanks for all that valuable information. Michelle, what role does an ALTA NSPS survey play in pre-construction due diligence?
It's huge. It's huge. I say this because early on in my career, I inherited a loan from a former loan officer in a small community bank. And I was lucky enough to get the call from a borrower who had been in his building for a few months when the neighbor came by and knocked on his door and said, "The corner of your building is on my property." And I will say that I was taken off guard by it. So I went back to the file to learn that the bank did not require a survey. The borrower did not get a survey. And therefore, we didn't have anything to fall back on. So I will say that I researched some good attorneys and connected my borrower with a good attorney. But obviously there was a lot of fees and additional costs involved. He was lucky enough that the neighbor was willing to take a form of payment in exchange for, in a sense, buying that corner of property. Then we had to go get it replatted. Then we had to get new title. And in all, it would have been a much, obviously, smaller cost for him to have got that survey on the front end than to do all this work on the back end. And I tell this story because, it's a true story. I mean, it happens. It was considered a small loan by the bank. So they thought it's a small loan, not a big deal. I tell all my clients today, I don't care how much you're spending. I don't care how much the loan is. It's important for you to know where your property boundaries are. And it's important for you to know, if we need to do anything, let's take care of it now, not down the road. It's a lot bigger if it relates to it later. He was trying to run a business and again, lucky enough that the neighbor was willing to work with him. In some cases, you have a neighbor that's not willing to work with you. So it's a big deal.
Thanks, Trevor. How important is communication between the lender, borrower, and the construction management firm?
Communication is key throughout the entire process. With as many parties as there may be involved, it's critical that the proper expectations are set early and they're set often. I always try to have a contact from each party copied on any and all correspondence so that every side is on the same page, and the messaging can then be distributed throughout their teams as necessary. I have a project that is now done, but I had a project that we would have a monthly meeting when they submitted the application for payment. The owner would be on there, the architect, the general contractor, and then our firm, the inspector and the project manager. Well, we would go step by step through the request. Any questions could be asked or answered. Additional backup that we could identify right off the bat could be requested. Everybody was on the same page, and that was one of the smoothest projects I've ever been a part of, and it was an ultimate success. We were generally on budget, and we were on time because the communication was there throughout the entire process.
Michelle, what unique challenges do SBA lenders face in the construction lending market?
Well, the biggest challenge would be rates, which is a whole other conversation.
We can resolve that today.
No, yes. And that some of the requirements, like the 10% contingency, the additional vetting and documentation of the contractor, and the use of the AIA contract. Yes, while it can drive the project cost up, and I will say borrowers push back on those three things quite a bit. It's considered a pain point for the borrower, so it's a challenge to overcome. But quite honestly, I say the beauty of doing an SBA construction project is that SBA lenders, if they really truly are following the rules, they're not allowed to really shortcut the process. That said, these should be positioned to the borrower as necessary for successful completion of probably one of the biggest purchases of their lives. So it's important that even though the cost, and that's what borrowers will fixate on, all of these processes are there to protect the bank and the borrower. So while it's a challenge, it's also probably the biggest benefit.
Trevor, how do you ensure that all parties are aligned on project goals and timelines?
Touching right back on the communication question from a minute ago, I cannot stress it enough. Whenever things tend to go sideways or there's something being held up, generally it's communication is broken down in some form. If everybody's communicating, everybody has the expectation, everybody knows the requirements, everything generally goes along smoothly. But when one party's kind of left out of the loop, or especially in the diligence side, you're kind of middlemaning between the two sides. When you're only talking to one party trying to work through something and not looping in the other, somebody feels left out and they think everything's stagnant, and then flags get raised when the process is occurring, but just they weren't included in that. So making sure everybody's copied into communication. The monthly meetings, like I talked about, were essential for that project, and it would be something I would recommend to every project.
Michelle, how do you balance your dual roles as an SBA consultant and a lender when managing construction projects?
Well, I don't know that I need to balance anything, because I think it's the same process no matter what hat I have on. I see them both as the same. Whether I'm consulting on, or whether I'm acting as a direct lender on, it's still the same things are needed. We still have to cover budget, timing, vetting the contractors, monitoring overruns, ensuring lien waivers are collected and assigned, and overseeing disbursements. Everything that banks should do to protect and preserve the integrity of the project and the SBA guarantee is everything that I should do as a consultant anyways. And again, it's all there to protect the borrower as well.
Thanks, Michelle. This brings us to the end of our discussion. Let me recap some of the key takeaways. We've learned about the importance of thorough pre-construction analysis, effective management of disbursements, the critical role of lien waivers, and the necessity of constant communication among all parties involved in the construction process. Ensuring projects stay on schedule and within budget requires proactive monitoring and addressing issues head-on as soon as they arise. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to Nick, Michelle, and Trevor for sharing their invaluable insights and expertise. Your contributions have been incredibly enlightening, and I'm sure our listeners have gained a wealth of knowledge. To our audience, thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to tune in next time for more expert discussions on the Smart Lending paths. Until then, stay informed and keep lending smarter.